these stumbling blocks, that's what Jesus is helping us to understand. It's what he was teaching his disciples about. So I had to think, what are stumbling blocks? Well, in the King James Version, the word is translated from the Greek as offend. And the Greek word from the text is skandalizo. It resembles our word scandalize. For the biblical communities, these impediments, these things that cause one to fall, the stumbling blocks, were scandalous and shocking. One commentator suggests that very little shocks us today, so the word seems quaint by our standards. In fact, I believe whatever gets in the way of our relationship with one another, our world, creation, and God, should be seen and understood as very shocking and scandalous. Stumbling blocks. Jesus has been pointing them out for the last several weeks of our lectionary as we've moved through Mark's Gospel. In chapter 7, you may recall, Jesus tells the Pharisees that they are putting human tradition ahead of God, and that what comes out of a person is what defiles. Worrying about eating with defiled hands or pots and pans is of little importance when what we say and do can offend and get in the way of our relationships. Next, we heard again the encounter with a Syrophoenician woman, a Gentile, an outsider, who comes to Jesus and he talks with her, breaking open an ethnic barrier, removing a stumbling block. It was scandalous behavior back then. Then in chapter 8, Jesus rebuked Peter for focusing on human things and not setting his mind on divine things. Jesus tried to help them see the stumbling block of thinking of Jesus as a warrior Messiah and not seeing that he would be a Messiah who'd suffer to bring about salvation. Jesus then identifies barriers for them, for us, to a full life in Christ, and speaks of what we must deny and give up. What are the things that keep us from following Christ? Chapter 9 shares another passion prediction in this gospel, which the disciples yet again don't understand. Another stumbling block. Then they argue among themselves, and Jesus tells them they shouldn't worry about who is the greatest, because that's a hindrance. Rather, they should be the least of all and servant of all, which is liberation. In today's passage from Mark, the disciples are complaining that someone who is not a follower is casting out demons in Jesus' name. They're trying to define who's in and who's out. But Jesus tells them that's a stumbling block, for whoever is not against us is for us. We're not to be arguing about who's in or out. Maybe the someone in this passage refers to one of John the Baptist's disciples who believed in Jesus but was not yet one of Jesus' followers. In examining verse 38, John Wesley said, "But to confine religion to them that follow us is a narrowness of spirit which we should avoid and abhor." Wesley asks, how often is the same temper found in us? Just a few days ago, Pope Francis challenged members of our Congress to see that we have a common, shared responsibility to care for creation, not argue about who's in and who's more right. That's our stumbling block. In this passage, we're invited to ask, what are those things we do and say that offend, are in the way of our relationship with God, that trip us up on our path to following Jesus? The Epistle James has been giving us much to ponder these last weeks. For example, a sharp tongue that wounds another is a stumbling block. When I'm too quick to respond from anger, I offend and hurt. But if I ponder before I speak, I can speak my truth and respect the dignity of another. What we do or don't do can also be our scandalous stumbling blocks. An action that offends, harms our relationship. And it is a sin that separates us from God. In matters of social justice, inaction can be just as bad. I use a quote in my email signature from Aung San Suu Kyi, the Burmese leader of the National Democratic League in opposition to the military junta. She said, "If you are neutral in a situation of injustice, you have chosen to side with the oppressor. If you're neutral, not doing anything, you're siding with the oppressor. Not doing anything when there is need for action is just as bad and is a stumbling block to relationship and the fulfillment of God's grace." We remove stumbling blocks when we make God's values and priorities our values and priorities. Then we are following the way of Jesus. When we love one another as Christ loves us, the stumbling blocks are removed and God's realm is revealed. As I discussed this passage with a former classmate this week, she emailed, "Too often we set the priorities of work, of family, of how we spend our money, of how we vote, etc., without thinking if those priorities and their values match God's requirement that we love each other. Do all of our actions demonstrate outwardly that our priorities are for the sick, the old, and the poor? Are we servant to all as Jesus instructed us last week? Do our priorities and values show that we are actively seeking and serving Christ in all persons? And seeking justice and equality for everyone? Perhaps you recognize those words from our baptismal covenant. I hear in the first lines of this passage Jesus telling us that it matters little what church we belong to as long as we are seeking the same goal and have the same holy priorities directing us. Pope Francis showed us this at the ecumenical service with all faith leaders represented on the stage with him. The differences in our languages, our cultures, or religion do not, in and of themselves, become stumbling blocks that prevent us from working together toward making the world a better place. When we get the stumbling blocks out of our way and don't put them in others' way, God's grace fills us with the spirit of truth and righteousness, and love wins. Amen.